This podcast contains salty language that may not be suitable for all audiences. What do two young women who both died at the age of 19 in Rhode Island in the 1800s of diseases for which there was no known cure or treatment at the time have in common? Yes, all that stuff. No one cares about that stuff. They were vampires. Or were they? I'm Cheryl Cook, and this is the Briny Heart, Tall Tales and Legends from the East Coast. Every 2 weeks, I'll bring you a tall tale, creature, myth, or legend that I've put through my haphazard research and writing process. Remember, I'm not a historian, and I don't play one here. Today, I bring you the story of Mercy Brown and Nellie Vaughn, the vampire girls of Rhode Island. Let's start with the story of Mercy Brown. Mercy Lena Brown was born in 1873 in Rhode Island and lived her short 19 years in Exeter. Once a thriving and busy town of more than 2,000 souls, by the time of Mercy's story, civil war and migration to the western frontier meant that there were fewer than 1,000 inhabitants left in Exeter. And those inhabitants lived a fairly hard-scratch life. The land and weather meant that most were subsistence farmers, barely getting by. To add to their troubles, a terrible visitor had come knocking. Tuberculosis, an infectious disease that typically affects the lungs. The afflicted will often suffer from fever, night sweats, and weight loss, and they will cough up a horrific amount of blood. Back in the good old days, before we understood bacterium like this, people referred to tuberculosis as consumption, because the victims would effectively begin wasting away, being consumed by the disease. There was no known cure or treatment for tuberculosis at that time, nothing based in science, anyway. The Brown family was not spared. It began in 1883, when the mother, Mary Eliza, died, followed soon after by a daughter, Mary Olive. Then, in 1891, Mercy began showing signs of the disease, and she had contracted galloping tuberculosis, so called because of the speed with which it killed its victims. So unlike many people with tuberculosis, Mercy died very quickly. In the years between the deaths of her mother and sister and Mercy's own death, her brother Edwin had been infected and was sent away to Colorado, where they felt the climate might be beneficial to his health. Though he rallied for a period, when he returned home around the time of Mercy's death, he too was dying. Many of you who are students of history may see where this is going. Yeah, the boy got the consumption, so now they're really going to take this seriously. Okay, sure, 3 women folk died, but yes, now is the time for the town to come together to do something about this whole terrible situation. And so it was that a group of local townsfolk, driven by understandable fear and ignorance, showed up at the Brown house and proposed to Mr. Brown a solution that they felt could save not only his son, but the whole community as well. By all accounts, Mr. Brown at first balked at the idea being presented to him. Unverified reports say his first response to the suggestion of the townsfolk was along the lines of, "You can fuck the fuck right off." Perhaps in their excitement, the townsfolk didn't explain themselves very well. You see, they felt that they knew what was causing the misery and death in the Brown family. Vampires. Let's take a moment to admire the Yankee ingenuity of these rural Rhode Islanders. In the face of a lack of information and answers about why the infection would spread through families, they devised their own explanation. One family member was clearly of demonic origin, the undead, sucking the life force from the rest of the family until there were no more. And the solution? Simple. Dig up all the bodies, poke around in the corpses until you find one who's not properly decomposed and thus must be the undead, yank out their undead heart, burn it, and possibly consume the ashes. Wow, you may say. How the hell did they come up with that? After much reading and research on this subject, I have a theory that I like to call several uneducated townsfolk and a big jug of booze. I have no other idea how a conversation around your poor, sick neighbors could wind up at, "and then we eat the ashes." I'm open to other ideas. Long story short, Mr. Brown eventually came around to the idea of digging up his dead wife and 2 daughters and talked the local doctor into giving him a hand. Accompanied by the locals, they headed to the graveyard and began digging. Now, which body of the 3, do you suppose, would arouse their suspicions as a vampire? Which one would show less indication of decomposition, thus requiring the townsfolk to take action? Could it be the mother, who had been dead in the ground for almost a decade? Or her first daughter, who had also been long dead? Or would it be Mercy, recently buried Mercy, who had barely been in her grave long enough to get down to the business of decomposition, and was buried in the winter? To everyone's surprise, Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, in their graves lo these many years, were not much more than dust and bones, perfectly acceptable, not at all undead. And then they dug up Mercy. These guys had dug up enough bodies in their day to know what a corpse ought to look like, and Mercy did not look right. Her nails had grown. Her hair was longer. She had shifted in her coffin. Oh, really? This is classic confirmation bias, folks. I would not have been surprised to have read an account that said she sat straight up in her coffin and said, in her very best Transylvanian accent, "I want to suck your blood." I mean, come on. Mercy's fate as a vampire was sealed before they unsealed that coffin, with both her mother and sister showing no signs of anything unusual, and the crowd gathered there who had more than a little invested in their diagnosis of vampirism. Somebody was going home a vampire that day, and it happened to be Mercy. But of course, Mercy didn't actually get to go home that day. Instead, they cut her open and took out her heart, and in this they discovered clotted blood. Eureka! A vampire. The local doctor, who was rather appalled by all of this, stood off to the side somewhere, muttering something about, "Look at all that tuberculosis in her lungs. Yep, that is a lot of tuberculosis. That would kill a horse." But to no avail. The vampire had been found. The locals had been proven right, and thus they could commence with their quaint New England tradition of burning the organ to ashes and feeding these to Mercy's brother Edwin in a curative tea. Very quaint, right up there with clam chowder and rug hooking circles. And this is how Mercy Brown entered into legend as the vampire of Exeter, Rhode Island. P.S. Edwin died. Turns out the burnt ashes of your sister's heart in a tea is no substitute for antibiotics. Hindsight, 2020. Now let's consider the story of Nellie Vaughn. Nellie Vaughn lived in Rhode Island and actually died a few years before Mercy Brown in 1889. Like Mercy, she was 19 when she died, and like Mercy, her current status is that of accused vampire. But that's where the similarities end. Unlike Mercy, Nellie did not suffer from tuberculosis before she died, though there are some reports that pneumonia may have been the cause of her premature death. Nellie was not posthumously accused of sucking the life out of the rest of her family for demonic purposes, nor was her body exhumed and her heart dug from her chest, burned, and fed to anyone. Her body was moved, however. She was buried on her family's land, and when this was sold, she was moved to the West Greenwich Cemetery, without incident. And it wasn't until the 1960s that anyone really gave poor Nellie Vaughn's body another thought. The story goes that in the 1960s, a Rhode Island high school teacher told his students that a 19-year-old girl who was accused of being a vampire was buried in a Rhode Island cemetery. He didn't give them a name or exact location, and he was probably referring to Mercy. But that didn't stop his students from heading out on a vampire hunt. After all, what self-respecting teenager would give up the chance to identify another teenager as a vampire and then use this information to ostracize and bully them from beyond the grave? I don't know, 15-year-old me would have been all over that like honey on a hot biscuit. So the students found the grave of a young woman whose age and location fit. And if that weren't enough, on her gravestone they found the chilling words, "I am waiting and watching for you." Of course, had 15-year-olds in the 1960s had the internet, it would have been pretty easy for them to learn that the use of epitaphs was fairly widespread in America in the 1800s, and Nellie's epitaph likely referred to her being in heaven, waiting for her loved ones. Most people would not then find this particular epitaph creepy, unless you're of the mind that having a deceased person hanging over you, waiting for you to die, is, yes, possibly a bit creepy. And this is how Nellie Vaughn got her dubious reputation as a vampire girl, but that's not the end of her story. A resident of Nellie's area, Marlene Chatfield, was reported to have had eerie experiences and run-ins with Nellie's spirit in the 1990s. In 1993, she claimed that while attempting to do a rubbing of Nellie's grave, the paper she was using mysteriously got wet spots on it, and her charcoal disappeared. You might say, if you're a bit of a skeptic. You were out in nature. Maybe your paper got damp from nature. And could be you dropped your charcoal in the grass? Maybe that's more likely than thinking that a 104-year-old spirit took it. How about you have a root round in the grass, Marlene? But Marlene would not be deterred. She returned on another day with her husband. He claimed that while standing near Nellie's grave, he heard a woman's voice distinctly say, "I am perfectly pleasant," which may actually be oldie New England talk for "gimme your charcoal, bitch," because his face was then covered in red scratches and he fled the cemetery. It was not recorded whether or not he screamed like Ned Flanders as he fled, but we are all free to make whatever assumptions we're comfortable with. Nevertheless, Marlene persisted. She returned again about a month later, and while visiting Nellie's grave, she met a young woman who was supposedly from a local historical society. Hysterical society, you mean? Because as soon as Marlene began talking about Nellie being a vampire, the young woman became very agitated, and Marlene decided she'd better leave. But as she was walking away, she turned back to look, and the young woman had vanished. It was as if this mysterious young woman had 2 feet and could walk away under her own steam. Whoa. That's the story of Mercy Brown and Nellie Vaughn, the vampire girls of Rhode Island. But that's not quite all. While researching this story, I found a few more interesting tidbits about the famous Mercy Brown. First, it was reported that Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, had heard of the Rhode Island vampire and based the character of Lucy Westenra, the best friend of Mina, on Mercy Brown. It's worth noting that in the book, Lucy was a sweet and pure character, but in the later Francis Ford Coppola film, her character was portrayed as a bit of a vamp who, in the end, was brought down by her own sexual nature. Slut? Another interesting thing I learned is that there's a bar in Krakow, Poland called Mercy Brown. It has excellent TripAdvisor reviews and advertises itself as offering cocktails and swing. Personally, I'm hoping that when they say swing, they mean that fun and spunky dance form that developed along with the jazz of the 1920s to 40s, and not those adult get-togethers where we're all nude and I'm not sure whose penis that is. To each their own, though. If you're ever in Krakow, do me a favor. Head on over to Mercy Brown, have yourself a cocktail, and send us a picture. But not of your penis. The Briny Heart is produced by the one-woman crew of me, Cheryl Cook, in my studio in the beautiful North End of Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's in Canada. Join me again in 2 weeks for more tall tales and legends from the East Coast.